Thank you so much, Alex and Gabriela, for inviting me. Of course, being the last speaker, you have a feeling everything has been said or everything has been shown. So bear with me. I hope I bring a few new insights still. But already I think it was a very interesting conference. And I have to say, when I came across the work of Gego somehow 20 years ago, as I was wandering through the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas during a conference, I couldn't grasp it immediately, but I think it's only very recently that I really started to understand my fascination with this work. And I was young enough at the time to dream that I could include this work inside the visible, and having undertaken many attempts since, also the exhibition online here at MoMA, we know it's not going to move. So, of course, we may say that we may almost see Gego as a protagonist in the sense of how she developed line into this almost, I would say, envisioning like a world wide web of connection and communication. But more than this, Gego's room was different from any other that I had seen or read about before. And of course, since the early 20s, models of space and of subjectivity have been conceived by, among others, Kurt Schwitters in his Merzbau, also in Germany, in Hanover, which was made of wire connecting objects in his studio, and then the wire was being replaced by wood and plaster. Lisitsky also showed in Hanover his prawn room in 1923, presenting it as a utopian space that placed heavy responsibility on the function of art, as the artist believed in the social structure to be changeable through art by acknowledging the audience, who were to become involved spectators. At the same time, Piet Mondrian proposed the designs for rooms such as this one, Salon de Madame B at Dresden, so that, and I quote, by the unification of architecture, sculpture, and painting, a new plastic reality would be created. Being purely constructive, painting and sculpture did not manifest here as separate objects, but would aid the creation of a surrounding not merely utilitarian or rational, but also pure and complete in its beauty, end quote. Inspired by his experiment of sculpture for traveling in 1918, Marcel Duchamp's Miles of String in 1942 filled the room by connecting all works with strings, yet at once impeded the movement of the visitor. Relentlessly, the string occupied the space, crisscrossing and looping, though it also literalized the space many of the surrealist pictures in the exhibition depicted. Perhaps this actualization of pictorial space may be seen as anticipating the urge to materialize in real space of the late 60s and 70s, however involving audiences rather than excluding them, such as in the work of Ligia Clark from Rio de Janeiro, then Karl Malich in Prague, Richard Tuttle also with his wire pieces, and of course Eva Hess here with Hang Up, and also rope beats in New York. And then there was, of course, also her fellow citizen, Jesus, sorry, Rafael Soto and Gego here in Caracas. A liberation of line occurred in tandem with the breakaway from the containment of sculpture into space and the reinvention of that social space. Having freed line from representation, these artists brought the drawn line, back to an essence, releasing it into space and effectively liberating the line of thought itself. Enveloped by the environment of Gego's Ridicularium, I always pronounce it in a Flemish way, sorry. Ridicularium, the experience is one of sensuous apprehension and of fusion with the work rather than only of optical analytical observation of it. So when in 1996, a critic wrote that here the drawing of lines had jumped to real space, the environment, to surround the spectator in a new and effective experience, as if walking inside one of Gego's drawings, which suddenly materialized, making real space its own. This description very much corresponded to what was written by a critic 40 years earlier in 1927 with regard to the work of Alexander Calder, who had been making three-dimensional forms drawn in space with wire lines. And I quote, "Much as if the background paper of a drawing had been cut away, leaving only the lines. The same incisive grasp of essentials, the same nervous sensibility to form, and the same rhythmic organization of elements, which are virtues of drawing, were virtues of this new medium." Being models of space as well as models of subjectivity, the rooms share certain aspects, though also thoroughly differ from Gego's. In accordance with art of the 70s, hers tends to deal with what is immediately apparent to the senses and the mind, and so presents itself as intimate of the presence and of the personal. There is an interest about how consciousness is constructed. In contradistinction with former decades, there is now often an attempt to communicate not connections in the art world, but in the world at large. An attempt also to communicate with an audience that hasn't been interfered with by art, thus dislodging the wedge that art has driven between perception and cognition. Gego's works engender a haptic experience, combining the senses of sight and touch, the domains of mind and emotion. To obtain this effect and affect, Gego devised a strategy both to disembody gesture in a molecular system and to rematerialize line itself in a physical alignment that is most apparent in her reticular constructions and paperless drawings. In her native Germany, Gego had studied for a while at the Department of Architecture of the Hochschule of you will know this by now, so I'm not going to go into this. And like some artists of a former generation, she has an interest in engineering techniques, industrial standardization, and architectural design, fused with the use of drawing and the dismissal of mass and volume. And their experimentation with space as a unity of volume and void, its non-substantiality and non-obstruction, would irrevocably lead to a critique of sculpture. The inquiries ultimately resulted in drawing in space becoming a modeling of the human milieu or a delineating of volume without confining it. And this process was most notably, of course, realized in the open form of the Reticuláreas, initiated in 1969. And since the beginning, Gego's work has involved lines, be they in pencil or on paper, or in metal in space, be they to construct volumes or to dissolve planes. Gego always used lines or the distance between them to produce transparency, interpenetration, or mutuality, as if studying their behavior and taking the lines into multidimensional space. Over the years, she meticulously and persistently developed several structural systems of lines in her drawings, with and without paper. and frame. Dibujos sin papel y sin marco. At all times shifting smoothly between drawing, monotype printing, paper weaving, and sculpture, as if there were no canonical boundaries between them. Her practice remained reflective of all areas that were considered as one. From 1957 to 1972, Gego's early work featured a structural system of parallel lines, compelling the viewer to move as to trace and unravel the complexity of the weave and to go beyond the visual effects. These ambient structures also contained lines that would depart from the system, and breaking from the parallel generated open new squares, triangles, and other forms. So following this break in the early 70s, Gego abandoned the linear system of planes and volumes in favor of producing masses of accumulated vertical lines that were hung irregularly rather than perfectly parallel, open to endless possibilities. The suspended chorus, jets of water, oh gosh, from 1970-71 were created from a massing of standardized aluminium wires with their ends bent into loops, forming a variable linking system of relations. According to the position of the link, the direction of the line could change so that often the linearity and symmetry of the waterfall, the gush of vertical elements, was disrupted, subverting the order and throwing the mass into a mess of knotted and spiraling wires. During this time and throughout the 70s, Gego continued to draw crisscrossing lines that seemed increasingly to liberate themselves from the structural system through the act of assembly itself. The troncos and Reticuláreas are the first products of this liberation from the structural system of parallel and vertical lines. Within these works, Gego developed a three-dimensional concept of triangular models as a result of the occasional forms generated by the loops, hoops, and tubes of the linking system. Different types of joint and different modular configurations based on the triangle, and also soon on the square, allowed for variables and changes in size, useful in adapting the work in progress to the site. This articulation of the module and linking systems permitted the structuring of Gego's drawings without paper and the large environments of the Reticularia that the artist continued to develop during her life. Okay, I'll leave it with this. The name Reticularia was coined by the art critic Roberto Guevara, who considered the work to be an area of the reticules. Interestingly, reticule refers to a network structure, but also to a system of fine lines or crosshairs in the focus of the lens of an optical instrument to assist observation. To reticule means to construct with a reticule, and reticulated means to be divided into or to reassemble a mesh or network, as Gego's writing appears to allude to. The naming of the environmental network structure, consisting of manifold modulated wire elements and connecting devices allowing for pliant articulation and endless adaptations in the construction that she called weaving, also brings into focus the primary correlation between architecture and weaving. Etymologically, the word nest derives from net, an open meshed fabric of cord, hair, or twine used for protecting, confining, or carrying. A meshwork relates to a framework of interwoven flexible sticks and twigs used to make walls, fences, and roofs in which to rear the young. To protect the new offspring, women needed to weave nests, habitable, water-endowed shelters. However, for Gego, the work was definable neither as architecture, weaving, or sculpture, nor perhaps as drawing, but as un trabajo meditativo, in which the play of lines engenders a radical departure from the boundaries of disciplinary categorization, giving the mind free rein to envision and envisage dialectics and dialogues. I was going to read some of the poems, but you've seen them all. So dialectics, a set of paradoxes, and we've seen about the abstract and the real, generated circuitously from the real and the ideal, as Gego writes. Line as abstraction, or the process of abstracting, can be seen as an oscillation between the observed in the real, in the realm of the real, and the created from the realm in the imaginary. So if drawing is defined by line and abstracting, regarded as drawing from and form, the line ought to become the medium in the materialization of the elusive thinking process. And if the concrete, the real, and the physical are considered to exist in space, and the illusionary, the abstract, and the ideal to exist on the paper surface on the wall, Gego's art, devoted almost entirely to the cancellation of binary thought, comes to hinge on the separation between without form and with form, as seen most explicitly in her now famous series of drawings without paper. Started in the mid-70s, the series Drawings Without Paper are the logical consequence of Gego's pursuit of apprehension, of comprehension itself, through the means of line, as in drawing and as in abstracting or thinking. Knotted together, the delicate wire constructions are remarkable in their fluctuation between 2- and 3-dimensional spaces. Neither drawing nor sculpture, and Gego always insisted, contrary to other artists working with wire in space, that her work was not sculpture. And I quote, "Sculpture, 3-dimensional forms of solid material, never in capital letters, never what I do." These works clarify her determination to celebrate thought itself as a means of originality, creativity, and connectivity, rather than as a modernist convention of division and exclusion. And while the lines materialize the projection of ideas into space, they appear, once viewed, in turn to dematerialize into means for thinking the world, each time becoming line as object to play with, as Gego suggested. Characterized as pursuing the dematerialization of the art object, her work can be seen, again paradoxically, to have generated at the same time the materialization of the line. While descaling had led to the disembodiment of traditional gestural and linear mark-making, as perceived in the minimalist use of the grid, this disembodiment was simultaneously counteracted by an intensified materialization of linear structures. Together with others of her generation, Gego witnessed a renewed commitment to materiality and tactile sensibility, favoring, that is, other senses than sight, but she also challenged the implication of the anonymous, systematic, and mechanical technology of what has been termed the diagrammatic order. So the total depersonalization of drawing found its dialectical counterpart in the reversal of its parameters from private to public, from 2 to 3-dimensionality, in a relational space of experience. Gego's work also examines the flattened geometric ordered weaving grid as a means of crowding out the dimensions of the real and of mastering the three-dimensional space in an instrumental, clear, or objectivist, optical way. However, constructed from different accumulative systems of joined wire cables, the fabric of the grid, the very weft of her weaving, dissolves, shifts, or fractures, leaving the subject viewer without the unitary vantage that provides a sense of security and control. The Reticularia liberates space from the tyranny of logic and therefore also frees the body and mind. Through the beholder's movements, the regular grid tracings seem to dissolve or dematerialize. Here, the striated space is not simply opposed or different from the smooth space. The two exist only in mixture and in passages from one another. In this sense, and conversely to one's expectation of striation in fabric, Gego's weavings, including her late 80s work with woven paper strips, seem to belong to the smooth space, where variation and development of form are continuous and unlimited, and where the lines go in all directions according to their linking. And I quote Gego, many years later, this is in Testimony 4, many years later I discovered the charm of the line in and of itself, the line in space as well as the line drawn on the surface, and the nothing between the lines, and the sparkling when they cross, when they are interrupted, when they are different colors or of different types. I discovered that sometimes the in-between lines is as important as the line by itself, end quote. So time and again, Gego's oeuvre seems to challenge the binary logic of dichotomy, to invoke multiplicity, heterogeneity, and anti-hierarchical relations. Her Reticuláreas, based on a modular assembly system of relations, operate similar to rhizomes with their variation, expansion, and offshoots, forming in this regard for centralized systems and functional logic. An assemblage is precisely this increase in the dimensions of a multiplicity that necessarily changes in nature as it expands its connections, Deleuze and Guattari wrote in A Thousand Plateaux. Even though they were made 10 years before that publication, Gego's peripheral, fragmented and pliant Reticuláreas correspond directly to this description of an assemblage with multiple lateral and circular systems of ramification, with a joint at every point between the lines. The work seems driven by a connective impulse, reclaiming a sense of interbeing and compassion while considerate of context and circumstance. Because constant reversals are operative in her reticular constructions and paperless drawings, Gego's attention is directed not only to the crossing or interweaving of lines, but also perhaps even more crucially to their interconnecting. To this purpose, she developed a number of delicate linking and hinging systems, which we also saw in the glossaria this morning. Claiming the interconnectedness of all things, these nets promote and pronounce the interdependency of everything and everyone. When any node in the net is touched, all other nodes are affected. Each node reflects all of the other nodes, and the existence of each node is wholly dependent on its reflection in all of the other nodes, inferring the notion of subjectivity as encounter. The build of the Reticularia, undetermined and dispersed, seems woven into space, and the viewer into the Reticularia and its surrounding space, as Monica so beautifully showed this morning. Gego, like Emma Kunz, Agnes Martin, who we see here, and Nasreen Mohammedi had an understanding of the textuality, literally that which is woven. For in an all-encompassing net is nothing less than the entire universe. And although their grit works exist singly, they also appear to be part of something infinitely larger. The awareness of this cosmic interpenetration and mutual identity, or lack of self-presence, has far-reaching implications for the understanding of interdependency in society. Modernist notions of self-absorption, origination, and separation are here challenged by an art of trans-subjective encounter, stressing relation itself, and I would add, it's perhaps a more feminine of experiencing the world. Gego's work, and we have the same image, Gego's work with its textuality, non-duality, non-locality, and sense of emptiness, transparency, epitomizes a different model of subjectivity, a subjectivity as encounter, in the cyclic movement of line to weft to line to web. Despite its gentle, abstract, tangible presence, Gego's work inspires social change and political commitment on a global scale, and it does so more urgently than ever, considering the environmental issues we are facing and the need to understand what freedom really is. Here we can return to Gego's line as object to play with, the goal of her work ultimately being reflection, un trabajo meditativo. For Gego, there is no separation between thinking and doing, no divide between the lines of thought and matter. There is one thing, to do something and to understand something, but one understands only when one knows, and one knows when one has experienced, lived it. And as Richard Schiff notes, thought does not make the leap of the imagination. Matter, something physical, does the leaping. Gego's leap is not without its essential materiality. It involves both physical movement in space and bodily experience through time. End quote. According to Gego, the work starts with her hands, her eyes, and her emotions. Materials instruct artists, and in this sensitive interaction, the works comes into being. In this, just as it again comes into being when the viewer apprehends the work. In this exchange of responses, in this trans-subjective relation, meaning is revealed, shaped, and renewed. If the materials determine what artists can think, the best way to activate both materials and imagination was to tinker with them, said Gego. Provided with materials, hands do the thinking as much as any part of the body. The handling of materials makes the making process real and not just imaginative or idealized. It puts art into real time and real space. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
No, it's fine.
Well, I have a comment, and I know that's horrible to start with a comment and not a question, but
No,
I'll
I
turn it
like
into
that.
a question. I'll turn it into a question, I promise. But just because this is the last wonderful presentation of the day, we've heard so much about control and discipline and freedom. I was really struck by the fold within the grid, for lack of a better way of saying it, the folds, the striations within the modernist grid, let's say, and then this idea of crisis, basically, a kind of subjectivity and the crisis of modernism, and going back to what Bruno was saying, how to have a kind of mastery without solvency within it. And to go, I guess to pose it as a question now, in this trans-subjective proposal, what are the potentialities and limits of this kind of crisis? How can we envision this if we are to take this as a model for trans-subjective notion of potential crises in the fold, but also the potential dialogues in the folds, if you see what I mean? Because there's something about trans-subjectivity that is very threatening, let's say, to a unitary subject. So how can we open up this fold, let's say, through your thinking, if that makes any sense whatsoever?
It's a comment, no? As I said, the first time I saw this work 20 years ago, I really didn't know what to make of it, and it wasn't known at all here. And except probably some people who were very close to her. And it's only through time that I was able to read it. But in fact, it's announcing something which we all crave for. And it is this, it is exactly that, that you have this mastering because you use the module in a way, a standardized element, which was very much something that was happening at the time. I don't know if you remember all these kind of modular rooms where you could change the seating and everything, and that was freedom, So within those modules, you could arrange your own setting and your own composition. But what you have with her, it's this transparency, this ephemerality, this this sense that you are you can go your own way even within the restrictions of society, and you can do it by perhaps even using those restrictions and find your way within that. I mean, that's how I'm reading it now.
One of the things about those, I'm sorry, please.
My question's actually about time. It's funny that we ended the session saying, oh, but it's time, because you also, at the end, talked about real time, and I was curious about the intersection of space and time that your title is hinting at. And what I was hearing was that in this relational space that she's creating, or a sort of haptic experience, the space of experience, that perhaps is a time which is unfolding moment by moment, or there's a sense of perhaps articulating the space of time so that within this installation there's a sense of time being held, and perhaps that interbeing is a time that's not moving particularly. I'm really curious to hear how you would talk about time.
Well, it's also when you think about it, and that's why the lecture of Sylvia was so instructive, and you see this, well, as viewers, we don't see it immediately, but the amount of time that is put into this work, it's as if some young Russian artist said it so beautifully to me. They say, we spend time to produce time. So they spend an amount of time making this, and often they make it together with other people. So already you spend time together, and it's so nice to hear how invested Gego was in education, and how she would love to work with collaborators. With it's like you spend time than to make this, which produces time for someone to see it and to spend time in it. And so it's like this this beautiful gesture. I find Gego's work very generous with time and with space. And so that's really, and of course at the same time it has this cosmic dimension in a way.
Yes, I was going to say that the ending of this symposium is very much bringing back the organic and the macroscopic, like universe and neurons.
Yeah.
If all of a sudden you look at it.
Yeah, it's a bit what I guess is still very visible in native societies, this connection between the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. And I find that she is hinging, she is trying to pull both back together again. And I think the interest in the last years in her work is because she embodies all these longings that we have, or all these, we try to find ways over and again to understand the world. And she is that kind of person who gives you, those hints.
I don't want to create a contradiction in the whole conference, because I really love Gego's work, but when I was small and I went to one of the Reticuláreas, it created, a sense of threatening to me. It was not this liberation, it was like something like a labyrinth that, was so chaotic that I couldn't grasp it, so it created, more like a unrest than a peaceful sensation. And then when I went back, I had the same, as an adult, and I had the same sensation, so I don't get that, sense of liberation. Is really, for me, it's really like the opposite. It's a very complex and, well, first of all, you lose the sense of orientation when you're there.
That's good.
I know, but for a child, I can imagine, I think it has a very contemplative and meditative, as you said. It's meditation, but also it has that, very chaotic, threatening aspect.
But maybe, maybe it's where she succeeded again to, to liberate us from all those dichotomies, from all these.
Right.
She brings all these, it's like paradoxes together for me, and maybe that's one of them.
Okay, well, any last moment, burning question? Okay, well, thank you very much, Katja.